content presented in this video may not be suitable for all audiences. Viewer discretion is advised.
Hello guys, and welcome to another video where today I didn't want to read a bunch more articles about elements and things for my spirit video, so I thought that instead I would record yet another one of my dad's short stories. This one is called Keep the Home Fires Burning, and I do hope that you all enjoy. I've been trying for many years to decide how best to record the history of such events as I have seen, as I have experienced, without leaving a reader certain that he has found the incoherent journals of a madman, or that she may have stumbled upon the chemically induced hallucinations of some delusional fool lost to the craving for both pipe and pen. That as I have no more insight now than when I began, I shall pour it out and allow any who read it to make of it as they will. With whom do you share impossible truths? Every person, I'm sure, bears witness to at least one thing in his lifetime which, in strict adherence to the scientific laws of nature which govern our worldly existence, could not possibly have occurred. Such things vary in nature from merely curious to downright terrifying, but all maintain the twisted quality of stretching the fabric of our knowledge in ways we never understood it capable of moving. Sometimes, when it really wasn't capable, perhaps the fabric tears. My observance happened over a considerable period of time, a fact which served strongly to convince me of the reality of the impossible. My grandmother's house, in which I spent many hours, seemed a large and rambling mansion from a youthful perspective. It was, in actuality, a small farmhouse tucked into a remote and isolated corner of the country area where it passed unnoticed by a world which had become too busy to care. It had, as was the nature of things in the agrarian lifestyle of the past, grown in spurts and leaps as my grandparents raised a sizable crew of farm hands, my father and his siblings, which supported it. As the old farm was successful in only the sense that its inhabitants never starved, rather than as any sort of profitable venture, this growth produced the general aspect of an unfinished jigsaw puzzle. So perhaps the illusion of rambling magnitude may be understood in a small and adventurous youth. At one end, loosely attached to the oldest portion of the house, was a kitchen in which it seemed my grandmother labored ceaselessly to feed the ever-appearing mouths of her family. Beneath this temple of culinary delight, gourmet chefs truly have nothing on southern grandmothers, lay what grandmother referred to as the root cellar. It was reached by an unobtrusive door in one corner of the kitchen nearest the main house. Stepping through this door, one was presented with a straight and steep set of stairs descending, forever in the mind of that youth, 14 steps and a final, overly long drop to the bare dirt floor. 2 long tables filled most of the space, each segmented into shallow boxes which held the raw material for many meals, onions, potatoes, carrots, and the like, in the dank, cool earth dimly lit by a single dangling bulb. The outer wall, away from the house, was built of slat boards, and from the outside you could see a few tops from the series of posts which seemed to lean precariously into the slope of the hill, running down steeply from the kitchen. The other walls were made of rough stone, and in the one beneath the main house was an odd little alcove like a fireplace, but with no chimney or vent. Many times in my childhood I was sent into the depths of this cavern to retrieve the feedings for the next horde of cousins, friends, and assorted hangers-on. It occurs to me only as I relate this tale that the basement seemed devoid of external life. No rats ever scurried into the gaps in the boards, and I can't recall a single spider web draped in a corner. In relation to later developments, it seems significant now, but it never seemed odd then. The cellar was just a cool retreat from the onslaught of summer as long as my grandmother lived. That life ended quite abruptly near Thanksgiving of the year I turned 12, and that loss altered the entire appearance of the rambling old home. It seems that lacking your young grandchildren to send, she made the climb into the cellar herself, and, burdened with the backyard garden's bounty, apparently missed that tall step at the bottom of the stairs. My grandfather, being out working the remnants of the garden, preparing soil for winter rain, never noticed anything until he came. Having searched the house, he finally found her where her head had struck a corner at the 3rd step up. He called for help, but it was clear that grandmother's spirit had departed before she was ever found. Grandfather was a fine, hard-working man, but like the majority of such men in that generation, he was utterly dependent on his wife for management of the household. My father's sister, Aunt Kalia, her husband Frank, and their children moved in after grandmother was gone to help him get along. Uncle Frank was a machine operator for a construction company, which moved him from job to job over the entire state. keeping him gone most of the time. But Aunt Callia was much like my grandmother, matronly and content, keeping the house and children presentable. My cousins, Frankie, David, Joseph, and the one little sister, Kay, were like most children, loud and argumentative, but reasonably well behaved. Grandfather was always, in his own way, as loving as grandmother had ever been of his grandchildren, but he visibly and drastically changed as she passed on. For as long as I could remember, his chair sat near the back window of the house, which gave him a view of the garden from which he had fed a large family, and which remained his connection to the soil after he had stopped actually farming. He sat in that chair only at the end of each day, relaxing with his pipe to unwind muscles worn from another day and a lifetime of hard work. Some of my fondest memories of my grandfather involve a shimmering halo of black cherry tobacco smoke, lit by the fading sun as he looked out at the labor of his hands. Grandmother's end left those memories to fade. Grandfather stopped smoking. From time to time I heard news of grandmother's death to the day of grandfather's. I never again saw him with the pipe. The chair he moved from the window to the back corner of the living room, behind the kitchen wall near the cellar entrance. There he sat, almost always, with a dark and brooding look, which lightened only when he was approached by any of us grandchildren, and which returned immediately when he was left there again. The garden filled with grass and weeds, remaining uncut unless the boys were coerced into hacking them down. Aunt Callia struggled to get him up, and my father and his brothers attempted to cajole him into hunting and fishing, but he remained a living and bereaved presence rather than an actual participant in life, and despite the continual presence of happy grandchildren and concerned but cheerful sons and daughters, the house itself seemed to lose and grieve as well. During a visit to the farm about 8 months into this dreary period, David, who was about my age, and I slipped down into the cool basement for the first time since the accident there. As always, it was cool and slightly damp, but beneath the dank cellar smell lay an indescribable heaviness. We walked between the tables, which looked ghostly and desolate without the familiar covering of grandmother's vegetables. The slat boards held their familiar look, but the wavy sag of the wall seemed sad and passing with the little opening in the back wall. We saw the likely cause of the new smell. A small, perhaps rodent, body lay mummified in the bottom. We got only the quickest glance as we darted for the steps, but it appeared to me that there were dusty remains of bones lying near the back. I can only consider this in retrospect, because I jumped for the stairs, leaping the long one at the bottom and starting upwards. It was fortunate, I suppose, that I made it to the stairs first, because David, in his leaping run, missed that long step. His face struck the back of my outstretched leg, and for an instant I teetered on the edge of balance. I managed to turn as I lost the battle, sitting down hard on the step above me and reaching to my cousin below. He caught my hand, and together we stumbled up to the top, bruised and frightened, gulping in the hot summer air of the kitchen like a breath of salvation. We laughed a lot that afternoon, sitting with Frankie and Joseph next to the pond, and managed to convince our conscious selves that we weren't afraid, but beneath the useful capacity for mirth ran an instinctive disturbance, born in the morning's experience. It is at this point in my narrative to you, my speculative reader, nod sagely and smile, certain that whatever impossibility I hope to relate lies truly in the imagination of a young boy, bereft of his grandmother and frightened by a series of simple coincidences readily explicable by normal means. Perhaps you are right, and from an uncluttered, unstimulated perspective can provide an explanation of this incredulity which has haunted my later experience. I ask that you read on and grant the comfort of logic and reason to the happenings of the past. The week before Thanksgiving that year marked the first anniversary of grandmother's death. Huddling together against the dark is an instinctual defense, and the family gathered at the farm on the weekend before it, rather than waiting the holiday itself. That holiday always held particular significance within my extended family, and gathering for it at the farm was a tradition which predated my emergence into the world. The family gathering had of course been, like ours, shattered and broken the year before, and the well-meaning gesture of the gathering early, designed to ease the first passions of disday for all, seemed rather to illustrate the wound left in our family structure. There was good food, laughing, and family companionship, but beneath it all ran a current awareness that not only had we lost someone important to our tradition, but that the tradition itself had been indelibly altered by the loss. Carving of the turkey, always performed with great ceremony by my grandfather, was deferred to my Uncle Edwin, who sliced it neatly and swiftly, parceling out slices like writing paychecks. The entire gathering took on the undertone of a play, carried on by understudies who knew their parts but didn't feel them. In this curious atmosphere of blended happiness and despair, it seemed almost appropriate when a screaming howl, sounding like an echo from the deepest bowels of hell itself, broke out from beneath the kitchen window in nearly perfect timing with the introduction of Aunt Calia's pumpkin pie for dessert. The men leaping for the door was nearly a sufficient crush to burst the walls of the house, but they made it out the front door and around the sloping hill on the end. What they found there was Vincent, my grandmother's old mutt hound, impaled on a large, long, up-thrust splinter on one of the poles supporting the basement wall. Shovels were brought, and Vincent was buried beneath the soil on the farm, behind the neglected garden. Much was made of thankfulness that none of the children had found that splinter, but on that evening the entire family sensed the brooding darkness that seemed alive, bent on the consumption of our lives. David and I didn't attend the unceremonious burial of Vincent, nor did we remain in the house with most of the kids. Instead, we walked back up to the slope of that hill and, standing well below the outer wall of the house's cellar, looked up at the scene of the dog's recent demise. The splinter had, of course, been broken partially off in the removal of the ill-fated beast, and now its stump stuck out less than 10 inches from the wall of the house, leaning outward where the body had been pulled away. 5 or 6 feet down the hill, a shallow furrow began leading straight back to that leaning stump, and in its bottom, scrabbling, digging claw marks were clearly visible. All of this we saw, but what struck us both was what we didn't. We were a family born in the country, and from a young age we hunted, fished, and participated in the preparation of meat both wild and domesticated for the table. From its killing to the pan, what we didn't see near that pole was a single trace of blood. David, who of course lived in the house, was greatly disturbed about the lack, and with a quiet shyness completely uncharacteristic of him, asked Uncle Frank about it. Uncle Frank hugged him and told him that some undoubtedly soaked into the dirt near the wall, and not seeing any of it was just a trick of the light from our vantage down the hill. David and I both heard these explanations and allowed them to ease the turmoil in our minds, but our hearts remained more disturbed by what we saw outside the kitchen than by the loss of the dog. I suppose it would be needless to say that the gruesome removal of Vincent from the family put an end to any joviality and holiday spirit which existed in the gathering, and the remaining few hours on the farm passed with a grim sense of fortitude. It was with an almost palpable sense of relief that my father loaded our car that evening, and we left the farm. Goodbyes all around were hurried and terse, and Aunt Kalia, standing in the door as our vehicle departed, seemed lost at being left behind with this new tragedy. Does this revelation disturb preconceptions of such a tale's origin, gentle reader? It was at this point that I began an awareness of being witness to events which were greater than the sum of observances themselves, and since with this awareness came a remarkably distinct feeling of incompleteness, of missing part of the picture. It is my fondest hope that as we progress you may notice something which I fail to see. Perhaps it is impossible, viewing the events as you do through the flaws in my vision, but it is my wish that something will make sense to you which has, for all these years, defeated my perception. With such desires, I would be remiss if I failed to explain to you that I was a bookish youth. Upon becoming aware that larger events were unfolding before and around me, I retreated to the caverns of the library near my home. Within its confines, I had spent many days consuming words left by others for my perusal, and now I went there seeking explanations for what might have entered my life and comfort against its continuance. I began, my friend, I consider you a dear friend indeed for having heard my tale to this point, to seek some purpose which might lie behind and explain this destruction of my stable existence. In this, however, my studies initially confounded me, and flights of fantasy alone offer comparison to my situation. Such, my friend, pray continue with me, was my plight. So this video is getting pretty long already, and I think we're only about a third of the way through the story. So I think I'm going to break up this story from my dad into parts because my throat hurts a lot. So tune in next week, maybe, or the week after that, depending on if an R Sleep video goes up, then, for part 2. There might be a part 3, it depends on how long these are. But I thank you all for listening, and have a nice day.